All right, so the first thing I want to show you guys today is just a couple of the projects that I got last semester that I thought did a really good job. These people received full credit, so they had everything that they needed. So the first one I'd like to show you is from Anna, Lorian, and Ayla. And so what they did is that they had their title Falling in Love with Stats because they did something dealing with the fall. So they're just being clever. So their question was something as simple as, what represents fall the most to you? And so they had some choices to select. And so they went through their steps. And so this explained to me, here's the process of what they did. They had to figure out the question. They decide what way will they be collecting the information. They decided to be doing this by geographical areas. So they settled on cluster. They also did a little bit of convenience sampling. So they kind of did a hybrid of the two. They originally wanted to make a Google form and send it out. And then they deciphered the information collected and then displayed some patterns. This was the graphic that they chose to do. So they chose a bar graph, but as you can see, there are several options in Google Sheets of how to do bar graphs. This one represented all 5 towns that they had surveyed. So of the people that liked pumpkin pie, I can see that there was 1 from Peterborough, 1 from Jaffrey, and it's like 2 from Hancock, since the total was 4. So this was just a breakdown of how many people said pumpkin pie and where they came from. So they're able to show the totals that they were looking at and where the responses came from. And then they explained what they found, and then they decided what could be improved. So this was the entirety of their project. They had the one graphic. They explained everything that I had asked for them to explain, and this received a perfect score. Another one was by these 4 here. They wanted to know, where would you rather eat breakfast? And so I thought that this was interesting that they targeted Instagram followers. So they put it on their Instagram story, and then they were able to collect information that way. Now, if you just sent out a question to your Instagram followers and you got 50 responses, that's technically convenience sampling. So what they would have needed to do is to collect more than 50 people and then use maybe simple random sample or another technique to pick from those 70 people or something like that. They chose to do a pie graph, a pie chart, circle chart, whatever you want to call it, to represent their information. They explained their results, some pros and cons, and then they used convenience sampling to get the most accurate results, and then how they would make it better. So this one's a little more black and white, as in here's the question, here's the answer, just bulleted information, whereas the other one was a little bit more of a fluid presentation. Like I said, both received full credit. So I just wanted to show you what the expectations of this will be at the end of chapter 2. Today, like I said, we're going to be going over bar graphs, Pareto charts, pie charts, and line graphs. Chances are the graphic that you'll be using for your presentation will probably be one of those 4. And again, we're going to use Google Sheets to do all that. Now, speaking of Google Sheets, right here in chapter 2 material, you'll see I have the 3 sections of notes, and I have the chapter 2 spreadsheet as well. So I'm going to be going to my spreadsheet, which is right here. It's been shared with everyone. And what you are able to do is you are able to simply view what's going on. Now, if you would like your own copy of this, you can go to File, make a copy, and then everything that's here will then be yours. So you can manipulate it any way you want, and you don't have to worry about it affecting my work. Now, what I'd recommend you do is one of 2 things. Either make a copy now, and then as we're going through the work, you can be doing it as well. Or you can kind of just watch, maybe make a few notes to yourself about what I'm clicking and where to go to create things, and then make a copy at the end. If you were to make a copy at the end, you would see the finished product. Or the third option is you can make 2 copies. Make one now, make one later, and then you can try to do this work based off of what I've done. So however you wish to do that, do that. Either take the copy now, take the copy later, or it's always going to be in Classroom, so you can just look at it whenever you want. Making a copy would just allow you to manipulate it any way you want it. And then the homework tonight / today is obviously, it's going to be, I think, 4 problems. Let's get this out of the way. Yeah, 4 problems, and each of them are pretty much asking you, one's asking you to make a bar graph, one's asking you to make a Pareto chart and a circle graph, another one time series. So it's really just doing one of each type of graphic organizer. So I'm not trying to beat you guys down with these things. It's just knowing how to create it and all that. All right, little disclaimer with the slides. Prior to the pandemic, all of this stuff was done completely by hand. So bar graphs, circle graphs, time series graphs, all of these, you would be sitting there with your lined paper or graph paper, a ruler, and you would have to create all these things by hand. Well, introducing the pandemic, that wasn't a reasonable thing to do anymore. So I started exploring Google Sheets. So these notes, even though they are technically correct, they're not really going to be that applicable because we're not going to have to create things by hand. So kind of the descriptions of the graphics will be important, but there's going to be a few times where it's going to explain how to create it by hand, and you won't necessarily need to know how to do that for this class. I just want to explain how Google Sheets is doing it. So I'm going to take a look if we have any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. So I will go ahead and continue with the notes. Like I said, I'm going to go over, say, the bar graphs, and then I'm going to go back to Google Sheets and explain how to create a bar graph, show you some of the things that you can change in it, then hop back to the slideshow. So it'll kind of be a combination of both. And again, I am recording this because some people reached out about not being able to make it today. So at the end of the day, I should be able to have it uploaded as a video, and I'll put that in the chapter 2 materials. So you'll have access to that video if you want. All right, without further ado, bar graphs. You should all be very comfortable with bar graphs. Those are just exactly what you think they are. What's unique is that bars can either be horizontal or vertical. People tend to manipulate the graphs so it better represents what they want to share for information. So it really doesn't matter if they're horizontal or vertical. It's just the 2 ways that they would exist. Bars are uniform in width and in space. So when we used to do this by hand, I would have to go through with a ruler and make sure that all the bars were the same width and that the spacing in between the bars were also of the same distance. So bars will always have a space in between them. The graph itself can display quantitative or qualitative data with bars representing frequency, percentages, or values. So what that means is that it could be quantitative, meaning it's an exact number, it gives you the exact output, or it could be qualitative, that maybe the bars represent an age range. And so that age range is describing the range at which 5 of those people were selected. So that's kind of the nice freedom we have about bar graphs, is that it can either be one thing, like the number of hamsters you own, or it could be I own between 1 and 3 pets, between 4 and 6 pets, between 7+ pets, things like that. Whenever we label the scale, we had to come up with a way in statistics to cover big gaps of information. And so they created what they consider a squiggle. And what the squiggle does is it's kind of like that heartbeat. I don't know what it's called, but you know, the heartbeat monitor on how it goes up, down, and up, down. It's just one of those up and down. And that means that you can cut out part of the scale and shrink it down. So if you have some information that's in the, say, thousands, and then you jump to 10,000, you don't want to have all those spaces of the thousands. You might have the 1,000 to 2,000 squiggle, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. So usually when it's a gap of 100 or over, you can use a little squiggle, and that just allows you to cut out whatever you're not using and condense your graph. All right, so let's take a look at the Google Sheets. So I took an example out of the book, and this is the bar graph example. And these were some stores that recorded their average annual sales per square foot. So Dillard's had $147, Kohl's $279, Marshall Field, which is TJ Maxx, Marshall's Home Goods, $220, May $192, Nordstrom $357, and Sears $320. Now, a little disclaimer, this book was published back in 2008, which means the information was probably collected between 2000 and 2005. So we're working with information that's almost 20 years old, which is why we got a new textbook, because this information needs to be updated. This was before Nordstrom and Sears were facing bankruptcy and before Marshall Field really started to take off. Anyway, so if I wanted to create a bar graph, what I would need to do is this work ahead of time. I'm going to go ahead and just type in the title of what it represents, the store, the amount of money, and then I typed in the Dillard's down to Sears, and I typed in their money amounts. Now, to create a chart, I'm going to use this icon over here that just says Insert Chart. Now, there's a few different ways to insert a chart. You could highlight and right-click. If you don't have this icon, you might have to hit the drop-down menu. But just for consistency, I'm going to highlight the information and just hit the Insert Chart. Now, what Google Sheets is going to do is that they're going to see the information I've highlighted, and they're going to choose a chart that they think that we want. Now, if it's not what we want, we have to change it, but they're just trying to be helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and click this icon, and what comes up is a bar graph. So I'm pretty much now done. That's all I'm looking for. Boom. Insert chart, it gave it to us. Now, I am going to change some of this stuff because this is not a comparison of money versus the store. It's the average annual sales per square foot. So I'm going to copy that and go in here. I'm going to edit my chart, and then you can customize. And customizing, you can play around with these options, but that allows you to change the type of chart style that you're looking at. I can go ahead and change my title to what I want it to be, and as soon as I do, it changes it. If you want to change your title font, your text color, anything like that, you can go through and adjust this as you'd like. Now, for just this being a class exercise and just for the homework, I'm fine with it looking nice and boring. For your presentation, as you saw with the bar graphs that had the different color coded for the geographic locations, that obviously was more pleasing to the eye and would have given more points towards the creativity. If I'm just seeing those, you might lose a half a point or a point out of the 14, which may not seem like a lot, but for such an easy thing to fix, I'd recommend just going the extra mile on that one. So that's all I'm asking for bar graphs. So again, you have to write down the information in Google Sheets, make sure you have your titles, copy and paste, insert chart, and it will give you a bar graph because that's the type of information we're giving it. Now, the next one is a unique type of a bar graph. It's called a Pareto chart. Now, a Pareto chart is when you want to organize things in decreasing order. That means it's going to start at the most frequent and end at the least frequent. The purpose of this Pareto chart is so that we can look at information that is most pertinent to our question. So if I wanted to, say, advertise to a certain type of animal as a pet, I'm probably going to look at the 2 or 3 most popular animals and only focus on those. So if a majority of people have cats and dogs and only one person has a pet raccoon, I'm probably not going to advertise towards raccoons. I'm only going to advertise towards cats and dogs. So a Pareto chart just allows you to prioritize the highest frequency categories first, and then you can see the descending trend. So for the example, I took the same stuff, and I'm now going to create another bar graph, but this one I want to be a Pareto chart. So to do that, I first have to order these things from greatest to least. Now, there is a way to sort, but the problem with just sorting is that I can either sort this column alphabetically, or I can sort this column in ascending or descending order, but they aren't going to connect the 2 cells. So Dillard's is still going to be at the top, but if I go from greatest to least, the Nordstrom amount will be next to the Dillard's, so the label is going to be off. So I have to have a way to manually move these around so that I can move them from greatest to least. So to do that, you can click on whichever row you want. I'm clicking on the number. My mouse has now become a hand, and I can move it to where I want. So I want it above Dillard's, so I'm going to go there. Now the next highest is Sears at 320, so I'm going to move it here. Then I have Kohl's, then I have Marshall Field, and then last I have May. All right, so just a quick visual check, highest down to the lowest. Now that I have this all done, I'm going to go ahead and highlight, insert chart, and I now have a Pareto chart. Once again, if I don't like the title, I can go in, change it to average annual sales per square foot, and I would be done. So a Pareto chart is a bar graph, but it just shows you the highest value down to the lowest. So if I were to look to invest into any of these companies, it looks like Nordstrom, Sears, and Kohl's would be the best companies to invest in. Ironically enough, we know that they're all going to have a troubled future. But anyway, back in 2008, those were the powerhouse stores. So that's a bar graph, and that's a Pareto chart. Now, circle graphs or pie charts is when you have the entire population. So it's out of 100% of the stuff. And then what happens is that of the 360-degree circle, we are going to take percentages out, and those wedges are going to represent the percent of the values that they were. Meaning, if I have 100 values and one category has 20 of those 100 values, then that wedge is going to be 20% of the circle. Well, how do I know what angle that would be? Well, if it represents 20% of the data, I have to figure out what is 20% of 360. And so 20% of 360 is 72. So that means I would have to take a protractor, a little flashback from geometry, and I would have to measure to 72 degrees. Once I have that 72-degree measure, then I would be able to draw my wedge, and I would have what 20% would be. And so if we were in person, everyone would get a protractor, and we'd spend an entire day learning how to use a protractor because people rarely remember how to use it from geometry. Unfortunately, can't get everyone a protractor, so we're just going to let Google Sheets do the work for us. So all this information here is just kind of a nice to know thing, but Google Sheets is going to take care of it for us. Important thing to note, when to use it is when you are dispersing your information into categories. So each of them have to have some sort of label, and percentages make sense. And usually you want 10 or fewer wedges. Nothing looks worse in a circle graph, other than it not being a circle, is when you have like 50 different wedges. It loses its effectiveness. So what people do a lot of the time is that if there are 5 or 6 categories that make up less than 10% of the information, just make that an other category. And so then that kind of collapses that. And now all of a sudden you're dealing with 5 categories instead of 10, something like that. All right, so down here, you see I created different tabs. I'm now going to move over to the circle graphs. Now the circle graphs, once again, I use the same information, but now I'm going to create a circle graph. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight as I did before, and I'm going to insert the chart. Now Google Sheets has been pretty on point, but now it thinks that we want a bar graph, or as they call it, a column chart. So I am going to, under setup, go to chart type, and I'm going to change which type of chart I want. I want a circle graph or a pie chart. So I'm going to click that. Boom, you now have a pie chart. As easy as that. Again, you can go ahead and you can customize to change the title. You can change with the chart style, the type of pie chart. So you can have a donut hole if you want. So you can have something that looks like that. You can go ahead and make it 3-dimensional. So just different things allow you to make it a little cooler. And you can also change with the pie chart, the coloring, the border, chart and axes. This is where you can change your title text to the annual, yada, yada, yada. Your pie slices, you can change the colors to go along with each one. So this is where you can kind of customize everything that you need. And of course, the legend you can create as well. So pie chart's pretty straightforward. It's just going to setup and changing the type of chart that you want. And as you can see, we're going to be moving on to the line chart very shortly. All right, the last graphic that we'll talk about will be the time series graph. So the time series graph is just going to be a line graph, meaning you're going to start by making a point at your first data point, and then you're going to plot all your other points, and then you connect them with a line. So this graph is going to start at your first point and end at the last one. It doesn't connect down unless your first or last value were to be, say, 0. So it's just going to be a line graph that's going to be floating in your coordinate grid. And again, you do want to connect all the points. So a time series graph specifically is a line graph of data in chronological order. This is mostly used on like quarterly sales and things where you can see a progression. An example of a time series graph is if you were to look at the COVID cases or the deaths during this pandemic. It doesn't just go up. It's going up and down because it shows per day what were the reported cases or deaths of that day. So it's going up and down, and then it finishes wherever the last point was. It doesn't just reset at the bottom. Now, back when I created this slide, TI-84s were used. Some people still like them, so I kept that in there. Then we went on to using an Inspire, which we plug all the information into spreadsheets, and then we'd have to use data and statistics and then go through there. Now we're going to use Google Sheets. So none of that was really pertinent. All right, so with Google Sheets, I went through and took an example out of the book. These were weeks that had gone by and then the distance walked in miles. So someone is maybe doing a couch to 5K really, really slowly. And they're just marking in the first week they walked 1.5 miles, in the second week 1.4. Maybe they're recovering from surgery, who knows? But these are just the miles that they walked. And as you can see, there seems to be a progression. Some weeks dipped lower than others, but I can see that they're steadily climbing from 1.5 miles to 2.7. So now that I've recorded all this information down, I'm going to go ahead and highlight, including my labels, and I'm going to insert a chart and see what Google Sheets thinks that I want. Now, what they're noticing is that my A column are numerical and in progressive order. So it's going from 1 to 2, so it's in chronological. And then my distance miles are just some random variables or numbers. So I insert chart, and it's going to go ahead and it's going to give me this chart here, this column chart. Well, when I did this earlier, it went ahead and it gave me my line graph. So if it does, great. If it doesn't, I'm going to go ahead, click the chart, and I'm going to do a line chart. And now what I have is a line graph or a time series graph of my progression of distance walked per week. So from week 0, which will be then 1 is right here. And you can see when I just move my mouse over, it starts to tell you each point. And so this would just kind of be the key, and that would be the graph. The unique thing about a line graph is that you can always tell what's the greatest rate of growth by measuring the slope. And so just looking, it looks like over here is pretty steep, over here steep, over here steep. So I can see that during these weeks, I had my greatest amount of growth. And I can see where it dips down is where I digressed a little bit with my walking. This looks like it plateaued, so I stayed the same, things like that. All right, so quick recap. We have our bar graphs that first you have to label the information, highlight, insert chart, you get your bar graph or your column chart. Pareto chart is a bar graph or a column chart, but it starts with the highest and goes down to the lowest. Circle graphs is when you have categories and you can break them up into percentages. You can see that Google Sheets went ahead and already calculated that Sears represents 21.1%. So if I got rid of this donut hole and I looked at this wedge here, this would be about that 72, 74 degrees. which makes sense. This being 23.6, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, the line graphs or the time series plots are showing chronological order as values go up and down. There's really no rhyme or reason as to going up and down. It doesn't necessarily have to have a pattern, but we are able to kind of conclude with what is going on those charts. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm also going